She stepped off that train with a wedding dress folded in her trunk and a name she'd practiced writing beside her own for months. There was no man waiting on the platform, only a telegram. The engagement is dissolved. Do not come further. She had already come as far as she could go. If you love stories about women's strength and love found in the most unexpected places, hit like and leave a comment letting me know which city you're watching from. I'd love to know how far this story has come, and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next part. The train had been running 4 hours behind schedule by the time it finally crawled into Harlan Creek, Wyoming territory, and Evelyn Harper had spent most of that delay with her forehead pressed against the cold window glass, watching the planes unspool beneath a sky the color of old pewter. She had been telling herself, quietly and repeatedly, that everything was going to be fine. She had been telling herself that for 3 days. She was 23 years old. She had $31, a trunk, a hat box, and a letter from a man named Douglas Crane that she had read so many times the creases had gone soft, and the ink on his signature had smeared from the warmth of her hands. "You will not regret this," he had written in his last letter. "I am a man who keeps his promises." The station at Harlan Creek was smaller than she had imagined. A single-room building with a hand-painted sign, a bench along the outside wall, and a stovepipe hat of smoke rising from somewhere behind the grain elevator down the road. There were maybe 8 people on the platform when she stepped off, a family reuniting with some noise and laughter, a man in a canvas coat loading crates, a boy sitting on a barrel, eating something out of his fist and watching her with unconcealed curiosity. No Douglas Crane. She stood at the edge of the platform with her trunk beside her and her hat box in her hand, and she waited. She waited because that was the reasonable thing to do. He was late, was all. The train had been 4 hours delayed. Of course, he had given up waiting and gone back to the ranch. And he would return when he got word of her arrival, and in the meantime, she would simply wait here on this platform in the wind and not let herself think about the expression on her mother's face when Evelyn had said she was going to Wyoming to marry a man she had never met in person. "He sounds decent enough in his letters," her mother had said, which was not exactly a ringing endorsement. "He sounds more than decent," Evelyn had said. "He sounds like exactly the kind of man I've been waiting for." The station master came out after about 15 minutes. He was a stocky man with a gray mustache and the practiced expression of someone who had seen more than his share of things go wrong. "You waiting for someone?" he said. "Douglas Crane," Evelyn said. "From the Crane homestead. He was supposed to meet me here." The station master's expression did something complicated. He looked at her trunk, then at her face, then at the horizon, as though it might offer him some help. "Ma'am," he said, "there's a telegram for you. Came in yesterday afternoon." She had known, in the half-second between those two sentences, what the telegram was going to say. She had known the way you know things before you're willing to admit you know them. A sudden cold drop in the chest, a stillness behind the eyes. She took the folded paper from him anyway. "Miss Harper, I regret to inform you that I cannot in good conscience proceed with our arrangement. Circumstances have changed. The engagement is dissolved. Please do not continue your journey. D. Crane." She read it twice. Then she folded it along its original crease and put it in her coat pocket. "Thank you," she said to the station master. He had the decency not to say anything at all. What? She did not cry. She had promised herself, somewhere around the second day on the train, that she was not going to be the kind of woman who cried on a train platform in a strange town over a man she had never actually touched. She had come close to crying, once, in the dining car, watching the mountains rise out of the flatland like something out of a dream. But that had been for a different reason, something harder to name. A feeling of having left everything she knew so far behind her that she couldn't see it anymore even if she turned around. She sat on the bench outside the station for almost an hour because she didn't know what else to do. The family with their noise and their laughter had gone. The man with his crates had gone. The boy on the barrel had wandered off somewhere. The station master came out once, said something about the weather coming in, and went back inside. $31. The return train to Cheyenne didn't run until Thursday, and today was Monday. She could afford a room at whatever passed for a hotel in Harlan Creek, and meals, and the train fare back, but not by much. And back to what? She had given up her position at the school in Beaumont. She had given up her rented room. Her mother's house had 4 children already crowded into it, and her stepfather had made his feelings about Evelyn's continued presence very clear before she'd even announced she was leaving. She was thinking all of this through very carefully, with the methodical focus of someone dismantling a problem rather than feeling it, when a woman's voice cut through the sound of the wind. "You're the one who came for Douglas Crane." It wasn't a question. Evelyn looked up. The woman standing in front of her was perhaps 50, built broadly and practically, wearing a wool coat that had seen better decades and carrying a basket over one arm. Her face was not unkind, but it was not soft either. It was the face of someone who did not have much use for indirection. "I am," Evelyn said. "I thought so." The woman sat down on the far end of the bench without being asked, set her basket between her feet, and looked out at the road. "I'm Martha Aldis. My husband runs the feed store. I knew Douglas well enough to know you're better off without him, if that's any comfort." "It isn't particularly," Evelyn said. "But thank you." Martha Aldis nodded, apparently satisfied by this answer. "You got any people around here? Family, friends, anything?" "No." "Money?" Evelyn hesitated. "Enough to get back to Cheyenne." "And then?" "And then I'll figure something out." Martha Aldis turned and looked at her for a moment with those flat, practical eyes. "You were a school teacher, is that right? Douglas mentioned it in his letters, apparently. Went all the way through to the teaching certificate." "I was," Evelyn said. "I am." Martha picked something up from her basket and examined it. A spool of thread, blue, which she didn't seem to need to look at after that first glance. "There's a man been asking around town for the past 3 weeks about a governess. Gideon Hale, out at Iron Ridge Ranch. You know who that is?" "I just arrived," Evelyn said. "Right. Well, he's not nobody. Owns about 6,000 acres out past the North Ridge, runs cattle, does well by it. Lost his wife 2 years ago. Consumption. And he's got 2 daughters, twins, 11 years old, and they've been running roughshod over every woman he's brought in to manage the household. 3 of them, I believe. The last one left after 9 days." Martha said this with something that wasn't quite satisfaction, but wasn't entirely not satisfaction either. "He's offering board, meals, and wages. 2 weeks' trial," he said, "then a longer arrangement if it suits." Evelyn looked at her. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you're sitting on a bench with nowhere to go and it seems like a better option than the other ones," Martha said simply. "And because Douglas Crane is a fool and you don't deserve to be stranded on his account." She stood up and lifted her basket. "Hale usually comes into town Tuesday mornings for supplies. You'll find him at the feed store around 9 if you want to put yourself in his way." She walked off down the road without waiting for a response. Evelyn found the hotel, a narrow building called the Territorial Arms that had 4 rooms and a dining area that smelled permanently of coffee and something fried. And she paid for 2 nights, and she sat on the edge of the bed in the small room upstairs with her hands folded in her lap, and she finally, quietly, let herself feel it. It was not grief exactly. It was more like the feeling of having built a house out of paper and discovering too late that it had been raining the whole time. She had not been in love with Douglas Crane. She understood that now, with a clarity that was almost embarrassing in how obvious it was in retrospect. She had been in love with the idea of him, with the clean simplicity of his proposal, with the way his letters had laid out a future for her in such orderly and comfortable terms. A house, a purpose, a place where she was wanted. The letters had been good. She would give him that. He wrote well, careful sentences, specific details about the land and the seasons and the work of it, the way the light fell across the valley in September. She had read them so many times that she had memorized particular phrases. The elk come down from the hills in October, and you can hear them in the morning before the sun is all the way up. She had imagined herself there for that, standing in some doorway hearing them. She wondered briefly what had changed. Circumstances, he'd written. She had a fair idea of what circumstances meant in a frontier territory for a man of reasonable property. Someone else? Someone with her own land, perhaps, or her own money, or a family name that opened doors in ways that a school teacher from Beaumont could not. She put the telegram in the bottom of her trunk, under the folded wedding dress, and she did not take it out again. Well, Gideon Hale was not what she had been expecting, though she had been careful not to expect anything specific. She had positioned herself in the doorway of the feed store at 8:45 the next morning, on the reasonable theory that arriving before him gave her more control over the initial impression. She had put on her best day dress, dark green wool, slightly travel-worn but respectable, and done her hair as neatly as the inadequate mirror in her room allowed. She was prepared to be businesslike, prepared to present herself clearly and without sentiment. What she had not prepared for was that he would arrive with both his daughters riding alongside him on a cart, and that the two of them would immediately begin arguing at a volume that drew the attention of everyone within a half-block radius, and that he would step down from the cart, look at the two of them with an expression of exhausted resignation, and say, in a very flat voice, "If either one of you falls off this cart, I will leave you in town." But neither of them fell off the cart, but neither of them stopped arguing either. He was somewhere in his mid-30s, Evelyn guessed, dark-haired, taller than average, with the kind of weathered, precise look that came from spending most of his time outdoors managing things that didn't always cooperate. He wore a hat that had been good once and now was simply functional, and when he caught sight of her standing in the doorway of the feed store, he stopped walking and looked at her with a frank, unhurried attention that was not rude, but was not shy either. "Mr. Hale?" she said. He pulled off his hat briefly. "That's right. My name is Evelyn Harper. I was told you were looking for a governess." Something shifted in his face, though she couldn't quite identify what. He glanced back at his daughters, who had moved from arguing with each other to apparently trying to dislodge a knot in the horse's mane, then back at Evelyn. "I was," he said. "Who told you?" "Martha Aldous." He made a sound that was not quite a laugh. "Of course she did." He put his hat back on and looked at her for another moment. "You're the one who came in on the Monday train." She kept her expression steady. "I am." "For the Crane situation." "Yes." He nodded, slowly, as though he was working something out. She had the uncomfortable sense that he had already learned all he needed to know about her situation from those 4 words, "for the Crane situation," and was now simply deciding what to do with it. She didn't like needing someone to decide something about her, but she had made a kind of peace with not liking it. "My daughters," he said after a moment, "have made things difficult for the last 3 women who tried this. I don't say that to frighten you off. I say it so you're not surprised." "What ages are they?" 11, both of them. A pause. "Identical. Their mother passed 2 years ago." "I'm sorry," Evelyn said. He received this the way some people receive condolences, with a slight, contained nod that acknowledged the sentiment without opening a door to it. "The position is 2 weeks to start, with room and board included and wages of $12. If it works out, we discuss a longer arrangement. If it doesn't, I'll arrange your fare back to wherever you need to go." $12 in 2 weeks, plus room and board. She ran the calculation quickly, not because she needed to, she already knew what her answer was, but because she was someone who needed to see the numbers even when the decision had already been made. "All right," she said. He seemed mildly surprised by this, though he covered it quickly. "You don't want to know more about what the work involves?" "You can tell me on the way out," she said, "unless there's something that would change my answer." He considered her for a moment with that same direct, unhurried attention. Then he said, "Clara, Ruth," in a voice that was not loud but carried anyway, and the twins detached themselves from the horse's mane and dropped off the cart with a coordination that suggested they did most things in tandem. They were identical enough that Evelyn felt a momentary vertigo looking at them side by side. The same dark hair, the same brown eyes, with a watchful quality that was clearly inherited from their father, the same stubborn set to their jaws. One of them was wearing a tear in her coat that looked deliberate. The other had dried mud on her boots that went up past the ankle in a way that suggested something had gone quite wrong with some body of water at some recent point. "This is Miss Harper," Gideon said. "She's coming out to the ranch." The one with the torn coat looked at Evelyn with calm, assessing eyes. "For how long?" she said. "Clara," her father said. 2 weeks to start," Evelyn said, because she'd already decided she was going to answer the girls directly, whenever possible. "My name is Evelyn. Your father's told me your names, but not which of you is which." A pause. The torn coat one said, "I'm Clara." Then she pointed at her sister. "She's Ruth. She's the one who put the frog in Mrs. Halverson's boot." "It wasn't a frog," Ruth said, with a precision that suggested this distinction mattered deeply to her. It was a toad. They're different. She cried either way, Clara said. It didn't hurt anything, Ruth said. Toads don't bite. Gideon pinched the bridge of his nose with 2 fingers. He looked at Evelyn. She looked at him. Something passed between them that was not quite amusement and not quite despair, but contained elements of both. I'll get the supplies loaded, he said, and walked into the feed store. Evelyn looked down at the girls. They looked up at her. The wind came off the ridge and moved through all of them with an impersonal efficiency. I don't bite either, Evelyn said. Just so you know. Ruth looked at her thoughtfully. Mrs. Halverson cried in the kitchen for 20 minutes, she said. We heard her through the door. And you felt bad about that? A small, complicated pause. A little, Ruth admitted. Good, Evelyn said. That means you're not terrible. Neither of them said anything to that. But when Gideon came back out with the first of his loaded crates, and Evelyn went to help him hoist it into the cart without being asked, she noticed that both girls were watching her with an expression that was slightly different from the one they'd started with. The road out to Iron Ridge Ranch was an hour and 20 minutes of country that started as something she might have called dramatic and gradually expanded into something she didn't have a word for. The hills built themselves up as they rode, layered in gray-blue in the morning light, and the grass was still dry from summer, but it moved in the wind with a quality that suggested water, and the sky above all of it was enormous in a way that felt personal, like something addressed specifically to her. She sat in the back of the cart with the supplies and the girls. Clara had claimed the seat beside her without asking, and Ruth had settled on the other side with her arms around her knees. And Gideon drove from the front in a silence that felt less like coldness and more like someone who simply had nothing to prove through speech. He told her over the course of the first 20 minutes what the position involved. Oversight of the girls' lessons, which had been irregular since their last tutor had left, help with correspondence and household accounts, which he admitted had fallen behind, and a general management of the household that would put her in authority over the cook, a Shoshone woman named Ada, and the housekeeper, a Norwegian woman in her 60s named Sigrid, who had been on the ranch since before the girls were born. They'll answer to you, he said, as long as you give them reason to. That seems fair, Evelyn said. Sigrid in particular has opinions. She'll let you know what they are. I can handle opinions. He glanced back at her briefly, over his shoulder. And the girls? Clara beside her made a soft sound that might have been a laugh. Ruth didn't move. I'm sitting right here, Clara said. I can hear you. I know, Gideon said without turning around. I'm not saying anything I wouldn't say to your face. This, Evelyn noticed, was apparently an acceptable answer. Clara subsided. She watched the land as they rode. A hawk, she thought it was a hawk, turned long circles over something in the grass to the east. The clouds moved with the deliberate slowness of heavy things. Once they passed close enough to a stand of cottonwood trees that she could hear the sound the leaves made, a dry and papery rustling that was nothing like the trees she had grown up with. It's different than I thought it would be, she said, to no one in particular. Ruth, who had been quiet the entire ride, looked over at her. What were you thinking it would be like? I don't know exactly. Bigger, maybe, but smaller. Does that make sense? Ruth thought about this with a seriousness that suggested she took the question genuinely. It gets bigger the longer you're here, she said finally. At first, it just feels like a lot of space with not much in it. Then after a while, it starts to feel like it has things you didn't see before. Clara looked at her sister. When did you get like that? Like what? Clara made a gesture that seemed to indicate depth of feeling. I've always been like this, Ruth said with dignity. You just don't listen. Evelyn looked at the back of Gideon's head and found that he was watching her in the small side mirror of the cart. Not intently, just the kind of glance that checked whether she was still there. She didn't know why she noticed it or why it registered as anything other than a practical check of his passengers. She turned back to the land. Iron Ridge Ranch came into view around a curve in the road. First the fence line, running in both directions farther than she could see, and then the outbuildings, a barn and a bunkhouse, and what looked like a smokehouse, and then the house itself, 2 stories of weathered timber and stone with a porch that wrapped around 3 sides and a yard that was working dirt rather than anything decorative. It was not beautiful, in the way she had imagined a ranch might be beautiful. It was something harder than beautiful. It had a functional severity to it, the look of a place that was serious about its own existence. The fence posts were driven deep and maintained. The barn doors hung true. There was a kitchen garden along the south wall of the house that had been put to bed for the coming winter with a careful hand, the beds mulched and covered. Someone here cared about doing things right. That was what it looked like. A woman appeared in the doorway of the house as they pulled in. Short, broad, with silver hair pulled back tight, and the kind of posture that said she had been standing exactly this way, with exactly this expression, for approximately 40 years, and had no plans to change. She looked at the cart. She looked at Evelyn. Her expression communicated something precise and complete, though Evelyn couldn't yet read the language it was written in. "Sigrid," Gideon said, climbing down. "This is Miss Harper. She'll be taking over the household." Sigrid said. She kept looking at Evelyn with those flat gray eyes. "You know about children?" "I was a teacher," Evelyn said. 8 years in a classroom." "A classroom," Sigrid repeated, in a tone that conveyed an entire treatise's worth of skepticism about the difference between a classroom and a ranch. "These are not classroom children." "Sigrid," Gideon said. "I'm not saying anything wrong," Sigrid said calmly. "I'm saying it plainly. These girls have had a hard time. You're a stranger. It takes time." She said the last part directly to Evelyn, and there was something in it that was not unkind, more like a warning given in good faith by someone who had seen enough to know what actually helped. "You don't force it." "I wasn't planning to," Evelyn said. Sigrid looked at her for another long moment, then made that same sound, and went back inside. Clara and Ruth slid off the cart and followed her without being asked, apparently pulled by whatever gravity operated between the girls and whoever was making lunch. Evelyn stood in the yard with her trunk and her hat box, looking at the house. "She'll come around," Gideon said, from beside her. He was lifting a crate from the cart with the efficient movement of someone who had been lifting crates for a long time. "Or she won't, but either way she'll do her job." "I wasn't worried," Evelyn said. He looked at her sideways. "What were you thinking?" She considered how to answer this honestly. "I was thinking that it looks like a place that takes things seriously," she said finally. "The ranch. The work. I think I can do something useful here." He set the crate down and looked at her with that same unhurried directness from the morning. Up close, she could see that there were lines at the corners of his eyes that had less to do with age than with exposure, the particular evidence of years of looking at distances. They made him look like someone who had spent a long time paying attention to things that mattered. "You'll find out soon enough," he said. "Wyoming winters don't give you much time to figure out if you're suited to something. They just tell you." "That seems like the most honest system," she said. Something in his expression shifted. Not a smile exactly, but adjacent to one. He picked up the crate again and carried it into the house, and Evelyn followed with her hat box and her trunk and her $31 and the particular grim practicality of someone who has decided, regardless of everything, to stay. That first night at Iron Ridge Ranch, she lay in the narrow bed in the room Sigrid had prepared for her. Second floor, corner room, with a window that faced east toward the ridge, and she listened to the sound of the wind moving through the grass outside and the distant sound of the cattle in the lower pasture and the small noises of the house settling around her. She had eaten dinner at the family table, a plain meal, substantial, prepared by Ada, with the confident efficiency of someone who had been cooking for ranch hands for decades. The girls had been present and mostly quiet, watching her with the patient attention of two people deciding something they weren't ready to decide yet. Gideon had asked her, over the meal, about her teaching experience in Beaumont, and she had answered directly, and he had listened in a way that felt like actual listening rather than the polite performance of it. Sigrid had served the coffee with a kind of pointed ceremony and said nothing at all. After dinner, Clara had appeared at the door of Evelyn's room. Just appeared, without knocking, the way children do when they've decided to do something before they think too hard about it, and said, "Do you know any stories?" "What kind?" Evelyn asked. "Not the kind from books." Clara leaned against the door frame with her arms folded. "Real ones. Things that happened." "Define real." Clara frowned. "Things you actually went through, not made up." Evelyn thought about the last 4 days. The train, the telegram, The bench, the two girls arguing on the cart about toads. I've been through some things recently, she said. Whether they make a good story depends on what you're looking for. Clara considered this for a moment. Then she said, Ruth cried last night. I'm not supposed to tell you that. But she does sometimes, and I thought you should know because she gets embarrassed about it. And she acts mean when she's embarrassed, and it's not because she's actually mean. Evelyn looked at her. Thank you for telling me. Don't make it weird, Clara said with great dignity, and disappeared. The wind moved through the grass. The house settled. Somewhere down the hall, one of the girls, she couldn't tell which, was still awake, moving softly around a room, probably trying not to make noise and succeeding only partially. Evelyn looked at the ceiling of her room in the dark and thought, all right, not a prayer, not a declaration, just a small, deliberate reckoning with where she was and what she was doing here and what it might mean. The man who had promised to marry her had not waited at the station. The wedding dress was at the bottom of her trunk. The sky outside this window was a different sky than any she had ever slept under before. She was 23 years old, alone on a ranch in Wyoming in the late days of October, employed for 2 weeks by a man who said very little and meant most of what he said, in charge of 2 girls who had just lost the 3rd governess in 2 years and were watching her with the careful eyes of people who expected another loss and weren't sure whether to speed it along or slow it down. She could go back to Cheyenne on Thursday. She could take the next train east and find something, a school, a position, something. But she thought about the hawk turning long circles over the grass. She thought about Ruth saying, it gets bigger the longer you're here. She thought about Clara appearing in the doorway without knocking to tell her something she didn't have to tell because she thought it would help. She closed her eyes. The wind moved. The cattle sounded faintly in the lower pasture. She stayed. The first week at Iron Ridge Ranch did not break her, but it came close on Wednesday. She had known, in an abstract way, that ranch life would be physically demanding. She had read enough about frontier territories to understand that the work was relentless, and the conditions were unforgiving, and that the women who survived it were built from something harder than what she had been raised to be. What she had not accounted for, what no amount of reading could have prepared her for, was the specific texture of the exhaustion. It was not the clean, productive tiredness of a long day in the classroom. It was something that lived in the bones, a heaviness that was already there when she woke at 5 in the morning and only accumulated as the hours passed. The first morning she had come downstairs before dawn to find Ada already at the stove, moving through the kitchen with the unhurried efficiency of someone who had been doing this since before the territory had a proper name. Ada was perhaps 55, compact and deliberate, and she regarded Evelyn's arrival in her kitchen with a neutrality that was not hostile but was absolutely not welcoming. I don't need help in here, Ada said, without turning around. I wasn't offering to help, Evelyn said. I was hoping for coffee. Ada turned then, briefly, and looked at her. Then she poured a cup and set it on the table without comment, and Evelyn sat down and drank it in the gray pre-dawn quiet while Ada worked, and that was, for a while, the extent of their relationship. Sigrid had left a list for her that first morning, written in a careful, formal hand that suggested English was not the language she thought in, detailing the household schedule, the girls' lesson requirements, and what she called the things that have been left to fall behind. The list was 2 pages long. Evelyn read it twice, folded it into her apron pocket, and decided to start with the things that would be visible first. The girls' schoolroom was in a small room off the east end of the house that had been, at some point, used as a storage room and still looked like it. There were books stacked without any particular order on a shelf that leaned, a table with one leg shimmed up with a piece of wood, and a blackboard that had the remnants of what looked like a geometry lesson still chalked on it from some unknown previous occupant of this position. Clara and Ruth appeared in the doorway of the schoolroom at 8 o'clock that first morning, with the expression of 2 people who had already developed a sophisticated system for making teachers miserable and were deciding whether to deploy it. Sit down, Evelyn said without looking up from the shelf she was sorting. Either of you. Both of us? Ruth said. Both, yes. There are 2 chairs. There was a pause. Then the sound of 2 chairs being pulled out, and then silence. And then Clara said, the last teacher sat at the front and told us to copy things. What things? Pages from books. Did you? Sometimes, Clara said in a tone that indicated the frequency was closer to never. Evelyn pulled 2 books from the shelf and set them on the table. She turned around and looked at the girls. Ruth had her arms crossed in a way that managed to be both defensive and theatrical. Clara was examining the tabletop with the focused attention of someone who had found something interesting there. "Can either of you tell me what you're actually interested in?" Evelyn said. They both looked up at her, which meant she had surprised them. She had found, in 8 years of teaching, that the question, "What are you interested in?" was more disorienting to a difficult child than any amount of structure or discipline, because difficult children were almost always expecting punishment and had no ready response to genuine curiosity. "Animals," Ruth said after a moment. "Specifically?" "How they work, what's inside them, the bones and things." "Biology," Evelyn said. Ruth looked slightly suspicious, as though this were a trick. "Is that what it's called?" "One name for it." She looked at Clara. "And you?" Clara considered this for a long moment with a seriousness that was clearly inherited from her father. "I want to know how things get built," she said finally. "Like, how you decide where to put the walls, or a bridge, or a fence that doesn't fall over." "Engineering," Evelyn said. "Architecture, maybe. Mathematics, certainly." Clara's chin came up slightly. Mrs. Halverson said mathematics wasn't something girls needed past basic arithmetic. Mrs. Halverson, Evelyn said carefully, was wrong. The silence that followed this had a different quality than the ones before it. She taught them that first morning for 2 hours. No copying, no recitation, no memorization of dates. And by the end of it, both girls were leaning over the table with the involuntary attention of people who had forgotten they were supposed to be resisting something. When she dismissed them at 10, Clara disappeared immediately, but Ruth lingered in the doorway for a moment. "The toad didn't hurt Mrs. Halverson," she said. "I know," Evelyn said. "She was just scared of it." "That happens." Ruth looked at her. "Are you scared of things?" Evelyn set down the book she was holding and considered the question honestly. "Yes," she said, "quite a few things." "Like what?" "Right now? Running out of firewood in January?" She picked the book back up. "Go find your sister." By the end of the first week, she had established enough of a working pattern to identify where things were actually broken. The household accounts were in worse shape than Gideon had implied, not through dishonesty, she thought, but through simple neglect, the kind of neglect that accumulated when a man was running 6,000 acres alone and keeping 2 grieving children from going entirely feral and had no remaining capacity for ledger columns. She found 4 months of unfiled receipts in a wooden box in the study, and 2 invoices that had been paid twice, and a supply order that had never been canceled after it was no longer needed. She brought the ledger to him on Friday evening after dinner. He was in the study, going through something at his desk, and he looked up when she appeared in the doorway with the ledger and her own set of notes beside it. "I found some problems in the accounts," she said. "Do you want me to walk you through them, or would you rather just see the corrections?" He sat back in his chair and looked at her with that considering expression she was beginning to recognize. "How bad?" "Not catastrophic. You've been paying twice for Aldis's grain delivery. I think it's a filing error, not anything deliberate. And there's about $60 that can be recovered from the Cheyenne supplier if you send the cancellation letter for the October order before the 20th. The 20th is Sunday." "I know. I can draft the letter tonight if you want to look at it tomorrow." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You didn't have to do this." "It was in the ledger," she said. "I was going to have to work with it anyway." Still, he took the ledger from her and looked at the notes she'd marked. His eyes moved through them with the focused attention of someone who understood numbers but had not had time to use that understanding properly. "You're quicker with this than I expected." "I ran the accounts for the school in Beaumont for 3 years," she said. "The principal he didn't have a natural ability for it." Something that might have been amusement moved briefly through his expression. "And he let you handle it?" "He didn't know I was handling it. He thought he was doing it himself." She said this matter-of-factly, without apology. It was easier than the alternative. Gideon looked at her for a moment, then looked back down at the ledger. "I'll look at the letter in the morning," he said. She turned to go. "Miss Harper." She stopped. "The girls were fighting less this week," he said without looking up. "Clara told me you said mathematics wasn't just for men." She remembered that. She told Ruth, and Ruth told Ada, and Ada mentioned it to Sigrid, who mentioned it to me. He finally looked up. The information travels fast around here. I'll keep that in mind, Evelyn said. She went back to her room and drafted the letter to the Cheyenne supplier, and she did not examine too carefully the small, warm thing that had started somewhere in her chest during that conversation. It wasn't gratitude exactly. It wasn't pride. It was more like the feeling of fitting into a space that had been empty without quite knowing it, and she understood well enough by now that such feelings were complicated and not to be trusted too quickly. The neighbors arrived on the 9th day. She had been warned about them in the indirect way that people on the frontier warned each other about things. Obliquely, with careful understatement, the way Sigrid had said one evening over the washing up, "The Carver family has land on the east boundary. They have opinions about many things," and then had said nothing further on the subject. There were 3 of them who came to the door that morning. A woman named Pauline Carver, perhaps 45, lean and well-dressed in the frontier manner, with the particular expression of someone who had decided something before they left home and was simply going through the motions of the visit. Her husband, Amos, who stood slightly behind her and said very little, and their daughter, a girl of perhaps 20, who looked uncomfortable in her skin and kept glancing between her mother and Evelyn with the expression of someone caught between 2 forces they didn't want to be adjacent to. Evelyn received them in the front room. Sigrid made coffee and retreated with what Evelyn was beginning to recognize as strategic efficiency. "We heard there was someone new at Iron Ridge," Pauline Carver said. She looked around the room with eyes that were cataloging rather than appreciating. "We like to welcome newcomers to the valley." "That's kind of you," Evelyn said. "You came in on the Monday train," Pauline said, in the tone of someone confirming what they already knew. "For Douglas Crane." "Yes," Evelyn said. "And he didn't meet you." "No." Pauline took a sip of her coffee and set it down with a small, precise movement. "And now you're here at Iron Ridge, as a governess." "That's correct." Another small pause filled with the work of careful implication. "It's a bit of an unusual situation, isn't it? For a young woman. Alone. In a widower's household." Evelyn looked at her steadily. "I'm not sure what you mean." "I only mean that people talk," Pauline said, with the practiced generosity of someone who talked about people regularly and enjoyed it. "In a small community, you understand. They wonder about arrangements, whether things are appropriate." "Mrs. Carver," Evelyn said, "I'm a credentialed teacher employed as a governess. There's a housekeeper and a cook in the household, and the girls are my primary responsibility. I can't imagine what there is to wonder about." Pauline smiled at her in a way that had nothing to do with warmth. "Of course, I'm sure you're very capable." Her eyes moved briefly around the room again. "Gideon has had a hard time of it. Since Eleanor passed, we've all been concerned about him." "That's kind," Evelyn said again. "My daughter Margaret has known the family for years," Pauline said, with a slight shift in register that indicated they were arriving at the actual purpose of the visit. "She's very fond of the girls, very experienced with them." Margaret, beside her, developed a careful stillness that suggested she was not entirely comfortable with being deployed in this way. "The girls seem to be doing well," Evelyn said pleasantly. "I'm sure they are." Pauline stood, which signaled the end of something. "We won't keep you, but I do hope you'll come to the church social next week. It's a good opportunity to meet people who have been here a while." She said this last part in a tone that made its meaning very clear, as opposed to people who arrived on the Monday train to marry a man who didn't want them. Evelyn stood and walked them to the door and said the appropriate things, and she watched Pauline Carver move down the porch steps with the proprietary confidence of someone who believed they had made a point. Margaret was the last one out the door. She paused at the threshold and looked back at Evelyn with an expression that was genuinely apologetic. "She doesn't mean—" she started. "I know what she means," Evelyn said, quietly enough that Pauline couldn't hear. "Don't worry about it." Margaret looked at her for a moment with something that was almost relief. Then she went. Evelyn closed the door and stood in the front room for a moment with her hand still on the door handle. She was aware of 2 things simultaneously: that this was going to keep happening, variations of this visit, in the weeks and months ahead, and that she was, against her better judgment, not particularly interested in leaving. Clara appeared from around the corner of the staircase where she had obviously been sitting on the third step, listening to all of it. She comes every time someone new is at Iron Ridge, Clara said. I noticed. She wants Papa to marry Margaret. Clara said this with the same flat directness her father used for difficult truths. Margaret doesn't want to marry Papa. She told Ruth she's in love with the school teacher in town, but her mother doesn't know. Evelyn looked at her. And how does Ruth know that? Ruth is very quiet, Clara said. People say things around her they wouldn't say around me. You should probably not repeat things you hear from the third stair, Evelyn said. I know, Clara said, without remorse. Are you going to leave? The question landed without preamble, the way the important questions always did with Clara. Without framing, without softening, straight to the point that mattered. Evelyn looked at her. The girl had her arms folded and her jaw set in that particular way that meant she was pretending not to care about the answer. Not today, Evelyn said. That's not the same as no. No, Evelyn agreed. It isn't. Clara held her gaze for a moment longer, then unfolded herself from the stair and went up without another word. And Evelyn stood in the front room listening to the wind finding its way around the corners of the house and told herself that not today was an honest answer, and that honest answers were the only kind worth giving. The second week began with weather. She had been told about Wyoming winters in the abstract by multiple people since her arrival, the station master, Martha Aldis, Sigrid, even Ruth, who had explained with great scientific precision the mechanics of a blizzard in a way that suggested she had given the subject considerable independent study. But the first real storm of the season arrived on the Monday night of her second week, and by Tuesday morning, the world outside the windows had been replaced by something gray and white and entirely indifferent to human schedules. The ranch did not stop for it. That was the thing she had not fully understood until she was living inside it. The work did not pause for weather. If anything, the weather created more work, faster, with less margin for error. Animals needed checking. Feed needed moving. A section of the east fence that had been marginal before the storm had come down in the night wind, which meant the cattle needed accounting for before they drifted onto the Carver property and created a whole different problem. Gideon was out before she was awake. She came down at 5 and found only Ada, who told her without turning from the stove that the boss and the 2 ranch hands were out checking the herd. Sigrid came in from somewhere with her coat still on and her expression set to the particular frequency that meant something needed doing. The cold storage is low on the salt provision, she said, to no one and everyone in the kitchen. It needs restocking before the ground freezes hard. I'll do it, Evelyn said. Sigrid looked at her. It's heavy work. I'm aware of what salt provisions are, Evelyn said. Tell me where they are. She spent 3 hours moving salt provisions from the outer storage to the cold cellar in the kind of cold that made the inside of her nose ache and her fingers numb through her gloves after the first 20 minutes. One of the ranch hands, a young man named Pike, who couldn't have been more than 19 and seemed perpetually surprised by Evelyn's existence at Iron Ridge, appeared after the first hour and helped without being asked, which she appreciated. Neither of them spoke much. The work was self-explanatory. When she came back inside, her hands were red to the wrist, and she had salt on her coat, and Ruth was standing in the kitchen doorway with a cup of something hot in each hand. Ada made it, Ruth said, offering one of the cups, but I told her to. Evelyn took it. It was coffee, heavily sweetened in a way she didn't usually take it, but she drank it without comment because it was the warmest thing in the room. You were watching from the window, Evelyn said. It wasn't a question. The upstairs window faces the storage, Ruth said, with the mild dignity of someone who did not consider watching from windows to be in any way unusual. How long? A while. Ruth looked at her hands around the cup. You didn't stop. There wasn't a stopping point. Ruth was quiet for a moment, then, Mama used to do that. Just keep going until the thing was done. She said it carefully, the way you say something you've held for a while and aren't entirely sure you want to let go of. Evelyn didn't move toward it too fast. She just said, was she practical like that? Very. Ruth looked up. Clara doesn't talk about her much. I do, sometimes. To Ada? That's a good thing to do. Is it? Ruth looked genuinely uncertain. Clara says it makes it worse. People grieve differently, Evelyn said. Clara's not wrong for how she does it. Neither are you. Ruth turned the cup in her hands. Do you think she would have liked you? The question hit somewhere unexpected. Evelyn took a moment before she answered. I don't know, she said honestly. I hope so, but I can't know. Ruth nodded as though this was the right answer. I think she would have, she said, and then walked back into the kitchen before Evelyn could respond. The offer came on a Thursday, 11 days into the 2-week trial. She was in the study going through the correspondence pile she had been working through systematically when there was a knock at the doorframe, and she looked up to find it was not Gideon, but a man she didn't recognize. Well-dressed for the territory, perhaps 60, with a formal bearing that felt like it belonged in a city office rather than a ranch house doorway. He introduced himself as Thomas Emmett, the chairman of the Harlan Creek School Board. I heard about your credentials, he said, settling himself in the chair across from her desk with the ease of a man who conducted business in other people's offices without self-consciousness. We've been looking for a qualified teacher for the Harlan Creek School for going on 6 months. The position hasn't been filled. He named a salary that was nearly double what Gideon was paying her. There's also a small house provided as part of the arrangement. Nothing grand, but private. Evelyn set down her pen. Mr. Emmett, how did you hear about me? Martha Aldis, he said without hesitation. She mentioned you to someone on the board. Your qualifications are good, better than what we've seen in applicants so far. And you're already here. He said this last part in a tone that suggested geography was a significant factor in his calculations. We'd want you to start in January. That gives you time to finish out whatever arrangement you have here. She looked at him across the desk. She was aware, in the carefully assembled part of her mind, that this was the logical answer to the question of what to do with her life. A salary. Independence. A house of her own. A position with standing in the community that did not involve navigating the Pauline carvers of the valley, or wondering whether she was overstepping the invisible lines that governed her presence in someone else's household. I'd need a few days to think about it, she said. Of course. He stood and handed her a card with the board's office address. We'd appreciate knowing by next week, if you can manage it. The board meets on Fridays. He left, and she sat in the study for a while longer without going back to the correspondence. She thought about the salary. She thought about the house. She thought about what it would mean to have a door she could lock that was entirely her own, in a building she didn't share with a man she was increasingly finding difficult to think about with any kind of useful objectivity. She thought about Ruth handing her a cup of sweetened coffee with both hands and saying, Mama used to do that. She thought about Clara asking, Are you going to leave? With her arms folded and her jaw set and her whole face arranged into the shape of someone who expected the answer to be yes. Gideon found her there an hour later, still at the desk but no longer pretending to work. Emmett was here, he said from the doorway. Yes. He told you about the teaching position. Yes? She looked at him. Martha Aldis told the school board about me. Martha Aldis tells everyone about everything, he said, but without heat. He came into the study and stood near the window, and she noticed that he was doing the thing he did when something mattered, standing very still, his hands at his sides, looking at a point in the middle distance that had nothing in it worth looking at. It's a good offer, Evelyn said. It is. More money, independence, something permanent. Yes. He was quiet for a moment. Then, the girls are going to ask you about it. I know. Ruth already knows something's happening. She watches. He said this without bitterness, more like a statement about the weather, factual. Clara will pretend she doesn't care. She does care, Evelyn said. I know she does. He finally looked at her. I'm not going to try to convince you to stay. That's not... He stopped. Started again. Whatever you decide, I'll honor the arrangement. I told you I'd provide fare back to wherever you needed to go if it didn't work out, and that stands. I haven't decided yet, she said. He looked at her for a moment, and she couldn't quite read what was in his expression. There was something measured there, something held back with the particular effort of someone who had learned that releasing things too early cost you more than you could afford. Take the time you need, he said, and left the room. She sat with the card from Thomas Emmett between her fingers for a long while, turning it over, and she thought about the bench at the Harlan Creek station and the telegram in her pocket, and the $31 that were now 43 because she had been careful. And she thought about the way the hawk had turned in its slow circles over the grass that first morning on the cart, and the way the land had felt when Ruth had said it gets bigger the longer you're here. She put the card in the left-hand drawer of the desk and went to find the girls for their afternoon lesson, and she did not take it out again that day. And whether that meant anything or nothing at all, she was not yet ready to say. She told Thomas Emmett no on Friday morning. She walked into town herself, which took 40 minutes in the cold, and left her boots damp at the toes and her face raw from the wind because she felt that the answer required the effort of a physical trip rather than a letter. Emmett received the news with the gracious disappointment of a man who had genuinely wanted a particular outcome but was too professional to make it personal. He said the board would keep looking. He said if she changed her mind to let him know. He said almost as an afterthought that Iron Ridge was a good ranch and Gideon Hale was a good man, and she understood this to be not a consolation but a genuine observation, the kind that a person in a small community makes when they have watched someone from a distance long enough to have formed a real opinion. She walked back to Iron Ridge in the same cold and arrived with her face still raw and her boots still damp and went directly to the kitchen where Ada was working. And Ada looked at her once and put a pot of coffee on without being asked, and that was the most welcome thing anyone had done for her in a week. She did not tell Gideon directly. She told Ada she had declined the position, and the information moved through the household in its usual way. Ada to Sigrid, Sigrid to wherever Sigrid deposited information that then somehow arrived at its intended destination. And by dinner that evening, Gideon said nothing about it but passed the bread to her side of the table first, which he didn't usually do, and she understood this to be acknowledgement. Clara found out from Ruth, who had heard from Sigrid, and appeared in the schoolroom the next morning with the particular expression of someone who had been relieved of a weight they weren't going to admit they'd been carrying. "You didn't take the school job," Clara said. "No." "Why not?" Evelyn considered several answers and chose the honest one. "Because I wasn't finished here yet." Clara sat down at the table and opened her mathematics book with more deliberateness than the task required. "Okay," she said, in a tone that foreclosed the conversation and simultaneously communicated more than the word itself contained. Ruth, beside her, said nothing at all, but she moved her chair 3 inches closer to Evelyn's end of the table, which was a Ruth-sized gesture, and Evelyn recognized it as such. What? November arrived with cold that had a different quality than October's cold, less like weather and more like a condition of the earth itself, something that had been there beneath the surface all along and had simply risen. The mornings were dark until nearly 8, and the evenings came in fast, cutting the working day at both ends. Gideon and his 2 ranch hands spent most of their daylight hours on the outer pastures, moving the remaining cattle to the lower fields where the winter forage was better, and the shelter of the ridgeline would cut the worst of the wind. Evelyn had found her rhythm by then. The household ran. Not perfectly, not without friction, but with the functional efficiency of an organism that had identified its working parts. She and Sigrid had arrived, through a series of small negotiations that neither of them ever named as such, at a division of authority that suited them both. She and Ada had settled into a morning routine involving coffee and silence that was more companionable than it appeared. The girls' lessons had found a shape. 2 hours in the morning, focused and rigorous, built around what each of them was genuinely interested in, and then the afternoons open for whatever the ranch and the season required, which was most often physical and practical and frequently involved mud. It was on the 3rd of November, a Tuesday, that Ruth woke with a fever. At first, it seemed like the kind of fever children got. Routine, unpleasant, expected to resolve in a few days with rest and warmth. Ada made a broth. Sigrid changed the bedding. Evelyn sat with Ruth through the worst of the first afternoon, reading to her from a book about the anatomy of mammals that Ruth had requested with the focused specificity of a child who knew exactly what she wanted even when she felt terrible. By Wednesday evening, the fever was higher. By Thursday morning, it was high enough that Evelyn sat with her hand on Ruth's forehead for a long moment after waking her and felt the dry, radiating heat of it, and went downstairs with a carefully composed expression to find Gideon before he left for the outer pasture. "She's worse," Evelyn said. He stopped in the doorway of the kitchen with his coat half on. He looked at her face and read what was in it with the accuracy of a man who had learned to assess situations quickly. How much worse? The fever's been climbing since last night. She's not eating. She's confused when she wakes up. Not seriously, but enough. She kept her voice level because it was more useful to him that way. We need the doctor. Harlan Creek Doctor's Weston, he said. I'll send Pike. Now, Evelyn said, before it snows again. He was already moving. She heard him calling for Pike from the yard, heard the rapid exchange of instructions, heard the horse go out at a pace that indicated Pike understood the urgency. She went back upstairs to Ruth. The girl was lying with her face turned toward the window, watching the sky outside with the unfocused attention of someone running a temperature. She was pale in a way that made the darkness under her eyes more pronounced, and her hair was damp at her temples. You sent someone for the doctor, Ruth said without turning from the window. Yes. Am I very sick? Evelyn sat in the chair beside the bed. Your fever is high. We want the doctor to look at you. Ruth turned her head then and looked at Evelyn with an expression that was more adult than 11 years should have produced. Mama started with a fever, she said, at the beginning. The words sat in the room. Evelyn did not look away from them. You're not your mama, she said, and we're watching you closely. That's a different situation. Ruth looked at her for a moment. Are you scared? Yes, Evelyn said. A little. That's why I'm sitting right here. Ruth seemed to find this answer more comforting than reassurance would have been. She turned back to the window. Will you keep reading? She said. The part about the skeletal structure of the elk. Evelyn picked up the book. Well, the snow started Thursday afternoon, and by Thursday night it was serious. Evelyn stood at the upstairs window and watched it come down in the dark. Not the light, preliminary snow of earlier in the month, but the kind that had weight and intention to it, accumulating fast, turning the yard and the outbuildings into shapes she barely recognized. The road to town was disappearing under it. Pike had not come back. Dr. Weston had not come. She went to Gideon's study and knocked. He was at his desk, not working, just sitting with his hands flat on the surface, looking at the middle distance with the expression of a man running calculations that weren't coming out right. The road's going to be impassable by morning, she said. I know. Has Pike sent any word? Nothing yet. He looked up at her. Could be he made it to town before it closed in. Could be he's waiting it out somewhere. Pike's not foolish. He won't try to come back in this. So we don't have a doctor. No. She stood in the doorway of his study and held this fact plainly in front of her for a moment. Then she said, Tell me what medicines you have in the house. Everything. He looked at her. Evelyn, I'm not panicking, she said, which was true. Something had happened in the last several hours where the fear had moved to a different part of her, still present, but compressed into something that was more like fuel than paralysis. I need to know what we're working with. Fever, possible lung involvement, a child who hasn't eaten properly in 2 days. Tell me what's in the house. He stood up and took her to the cabinet in the back room where the household medicines were kept, and they went through it together. Quinine, which she set aside. Camphor oil. Willow bark tea, which she put on the counter immediately. A bottle of something labeled in a pharmacist's hand that turned out to be a mild sedative she decided against. She found clean cloth and a basin, and she went back upstairs while Gideon followed to check on Ruth himself. Clara was in the hallway outside Ruth's door, sitting on the floor with her back against the wall and her knees pulled up. She had been there, Evelyn realized, for some time. She looked up when they came up the stairs, and she had the particular look of a child who has been frightened for hours and is managing it through sheer suppression. Gideon crouched down in front of her. Hey, he said, in a voice Evelyn hadn't heard from him before, quieter, stripped of the managerial distance he carried most of the time. She's going to be all right. You don't know that, Clara said. He didn't argue with her. No, he said. I don't. But Miss Harper is going to take care of her, and I'm going to be right here. Clara looked past him at Evelyn. Something passed between them that was too complicated and too honest to be reduced to a look, but that was what it was. She asked for you, Clara said to Evelyn, before she fell asleep. She said your name. Evelyn moved past them both into the room. The night was the longest she had experienced since arriving in Wyoming, and Wyoming nights were not short. She worked systematically. The willow bark tea she brewed strong and cool to drinkable, and got into Ruth in small amounts every hour, coaxing it past the girl's half-waking resistance with the patient persistence of someone who understood that a little repeated enough times eventually added up to enough. She applied the cool cloths to Ruth's forehead and the back of her neck, replacing them when they warmed, which happened faster than it should have. She talked to Ruth when Ruth was conscious enough to hear, not about anything consequential, just the ordinary running narrative of someone present and attending, the kind of voice that said you are not alone in this without making a speech of it. Gideon came in at midnight and found her at the bedside and stopped in the doorway with his lamp. "Let me sit for a while," he said. "You should sleep." "I'm not tired." "That's not what I asked." She looked at him across the dark room. "I'm not leaving her right now," she said simply. He came in and sat in the second chair, the one he'd brought up from the study earlier, and for a while they were both just in the room with Ruth and the sound of the wind and the snow against the window, and the lamp making its small yellow circle of warmth on the floor between them. "She asked about Eleanor," Gideon said, after a long quiet. "Earlier, when I was sitting with her." He said it to the floor, or to the lamp, or to no particular point. She wanted to know if Eleanor had been scared at the end. Evelyn didn't answer immediately. She waited for him to continue if he was going to. "I didn't know what to say to her," he said. "I still don't." "What did you tell her?" "That her mother was the bravest person I knew." He was quiet for a moment. "Which is true, but it wasn't what she was asking." "What was she asking?" He looked up then, across Ruth's sleeping form, and there was something in his face that the careful exterior usually kept well back from the surface. "She was asking if it hurt," he said, "and if Eleanor had known it was happening, and if she'd been alone." The room held this. "What did you say?" Evelyn asked. "I said she wasn't alone." He looked back down. That part was true. She reached across and adjusted the cloth on Ruth's forehead. The fever was still high, but it had not climbed in the last hour, which she was treating as a cautious positive. "Claire's asleep," she said. "Finally, about an hour ago. Sigrid's with her." "Good." She settled back into her chair. "Try to sleep here if you can. I'll wake you if anything changes." "Evelyn?" She looked at him. "Why did you stay?" he said. It was a genuine question, not rhetorical, not accusatory. Just the question of someone who had been sitting in the dark long enough to run out of the defenses that kept you from asking the things you actually wanted to know. She thought about Thomas Emmett and his salary and his small private house. She thought about the bench at the Harlan Creek station and the telegram and the $31. She thought about Ruth moving her chair 3 inches closer and Clara saying okay with everything she meant underneath it. "Because I wasn't finished," she said, which was what she'd told Clara. Then she thought for a moment and added, "And because this is the first place in a long time where the work I do actually matters to specific people in front of me. Not to a classroom of 30, to these 2 girls and this house." She paused. "And I think I needed that more than I knew." He was quiet for a while. Then he said, "I'm glad you stayed." She nodded and looked back at Ruth, and the wind moved against the windows with a sound like something pressing its weight against the glass, and neither of them said anything else for a long time. The fever broke on Friday, just before dawn. Evelyn had been awake continuously for 22 hours when she put her hand to Ruth's forehead and felt the difference. Subtle at first, like the shift in her room when someone opens a window somewhere else in the house, just a change in the quality of the air. She pressed her palm flat against the girl's skin and waited, and yes, the burning edge was gone, or going, replaced by a warmth that was warmer than normal, but no longer the dry, alarming heat of the night. She exhaled very slowly and set her other hand over her eyes for a moment. Gideon had fallen asleep in the chair around 3. She didn't wake him. She sat with her hand still resting lightly on Ruth's forehead, and she listened to the sounds of the house. The fire settling, the wind diminished now to something less insistent, the particular deep quiet of a house after a long crisis, when everything is still standing and you're beginning to believe it. Ruth opened her eyes around 6. She looked at Evelyn with the slow focus of someone returning from a distance. "You're still here," she said. "Yes." Ruth looked at the window where the light was coming in pale and thin through the frost on the glass. "Did the doctor come?" "Not yet. The road was closed. So it was just you. And your father, and Sigrid, and Ada." Ruth was quiet for a moment. "Is Clara upset?" "She's sleeping. She was worried about you." "She doesn't like to say so," Ruth said, which was a very Ruth observation. "I know. Drink some water." Ruth drank the water Evelyn held for her, and when she lay back she looked at Evelyn with eyes that were clearer than they'd been in 2 days. Still tired, still marked by what her body had been through, but present in a way that had been intermittent and unreliable through the night. "Evelyn," she said. I'm glad you didn't take that school job." Evelyn looked at her. "You knew about that?" "Everyone knew," Ruth said, with the faint shade of something that might eventually become a smile. Ada told Sigrid. "Of course she did." "Are you staying? For real this time?" The question had a different weight than when Clara had asked it, because Ruth asked things with the intention of receiving honest answers and had a child's accurate instinct for when she wasn't getting one. "For real this time," Evelyn said. Ruth closed her eyes. "Good," she said. "I want to finish the chapter about elk anatomy." She was asleep again in 3 minutes. Evelyn sat with the empty water cup in her hands and looked at the frost patterns on the window, elaborate and precise and entirely indifferent to everything that had happened in this room, and she felt something that she did not immediately have a name for. A composite thing, assembled from exhaustion and relief, and something that was deeper than either, something that had to do with having stayed when staying was hard, and finding, on the other side of the hardest part, that you were still intact. Gideon woke around 7. He looked at Ruth first. That was the first thing he did, before he was fully awake, his eyes going to his daughter. And Evelyn watched his face when he saw that Ruth was breathing steadily, and the color of her face had changed, and she saw what that did to him, the way it moved through him like something released from a long tension, and she looked away because it felt private. "Fever broke," she said. "About an hour ago." He put his hand to Ruth's forehead with the same instinct she'd had, the need to feel it directly, not just be told. He stood there for a moment with his hand resting there, very still. "She drank water," Evelyn said. "Woke up and talked. She'll need a few days to recover, but I think the worst is past." He took his hand back and turned to look at Evelyn. She was aware suddenly of how she must look. 22 hours in this chair, her dress wrinkled and her hair coming down from whatever she'd done with it the previous morning, her eyes carrying the particular flatness of extended sleeplessness. She was not at her best. She was, in fact, approximately the opposite of her best. He looked at her for a long moment, not at her hair or her dress or the evidence of the night, at her. "Come downstairs," he said. "Ada will have something on." "I don't want to leave her. I'll stay with her. Come downstairs and eat something." She went. Ada put food in front of her without ceremony, and she ate it, eggs and bread and something that had been kept warm on the stove. She couldn't afterward have said exactly what. And she drank the coffee that appeared at her elbow, and she sat at the kitchen table in the gray morning light of a Friday, after a snowstorm while the ranch began its day around her. Clara came in at 7:30, still in her nightgown, and stopped when she saw Evelyn. "Papa said the fever broke," Clara said. "Yes." Clara sat down at the table across from her. She was not a child who cried easily. Evelyn had not seen her cry once in the weeks she'd been here. But there were marks around her eyes that suggested she had done it privately at some point in the night, and she was not going to mention this, and neither was Evelyn. "Is she going to be okay?" Clara said. "Yes, she needs to rest, but yes." Clara put her elbows on the table and her face in her hands and stayed that way for a moment. Then she straightened and reached for the bread basket and tore off a piece with a purposefulness that signaled the moment of vulnerability was over. "She's going to be unbearable when she gets better," Clara said. "She's going to want everyone to read to her and bring her things." "Probably," Evelyn agreed. "I'll read to her," Clara said, to the bread. "For a while, if she wants." "That would be good. Don't make it a thing." "I'm not making it anything," Evelyn said. Ada put a cup of milk in front of Clara, and Clara drank it without objection, which was the clearest sign Evelyn had yet seen that the girl had been more frightened than she'd let on, because under ordinary circumstances, Clara had strong feelings about milk. Dr. Weston arrived on Saturday, the road having been cleared enough by then for a determined man on a good horse. He was a spare, serious man in his 60s who examined Ruth with the focused economy of someone who had been practicing medicine in rough country long enough to waste nothing. He pronounced her recovering from a severe respiratory fever, prescribed continued rest and the kind of practical care she'd already been receiving, and looked around the room with a professional eye. "Who managed the night?" he said to Gideon. "Miss Harper," Gideon said from the doorway. Weston looked at Evelyn. "You've got medical training?" "No," she said. "I've got common sense and a book about mammalian physiology." He considered her for a moment with the evaluating expression of a man who had seen both trained incompetence and untrained competence and knew which one he trusted more. "Willow bark?" he said. "Tea, every hour." "Good." He packed his bag. She'd have been fine eventually regardless, most likely, but the attention made the difference in how quickly. "Keep doing what you're doing." He said his goodbyes and left, and Evelyn stood in the hallway and heard his horse leave the yard, and then she heard nothing for a moment except the sound of the house. Gideon came out of Ruth's room and stopped when he saw her. She was standing in the hallway with her back against the wall, and she was not crying. She was not the kind of person who cried easily or publicly, but she was doing the thing she did sometimes when the compressed fear finally found its release, which was to stand very still with her eyes closed and her hands flat against the wall behind her and just breathe for a moment. He stopped a few feet away from her. He didn't say anything. She was grateful for that. After a moment, she opened her eyes. "Sorry," she said. "Don't," he said. She looked at him. He was close enough that she could see the evidence of the last 2 days in his face. The tiredness, the night in the chair, the particular drawn quality that came from fear that had not entirely finished leaving. "Evelyn," he said. And there was something in the way he said her name. Not Miss Harper, not the formal address they'd been using for weeks. That changed the quality of the air in the hallway. "You've been holding this household together since the day you got here," he said. "The accounts, the girls, the storeroom, all of it. And then last night," he stopped. "I don't have the right words for what you did last night." "You would have managed," she said. "Maybe," he said, "but you were there. And that's—" He looked at her. "That's not nothing. That's not even close to nothing." She held his gaze. Outside, somewhere down in the lower pasture, one of the cattle sounded. A distant, ordinary noise that had nothing to do with anything, and was nevertheless, in this moment, exactly the right counterpoint to the silence between them. "I want you to stay," he said, "not as a governess, not as—" He made a brief, frustrated gesture at the inadequacy of employment categories. "I want you to stay as a part of this, of the ranch, of the family." He was not a man who found this kind of speech easy, and it showed. And she found that she trusted him more for it than she would have if it had come smoothly. "I know it's not what either of us expected. I know it's not simple. But I'm asking." She looked at him standing in the hallway of Iron Ridge Ranch with his coat still on from checking the stock and the evidence of a hard night in his face, asking her something that had clearly cost him something to ask. And she thought about the telegram at the bottom of her trunk and Douglas Crane and the wedding dress she had not unfolded since she arrived, and the particular way the Wyoming sky looked in the early morning from the east-facing window of her room. She had come here as a temporary refuge. She had stayed because she wasn't finished. She looked at Gideon Hale and said, "I'm not going anywhere." He exhaled, just slightly, just enough to show he'd been holding something. Then he nodded, once, the way he nodded when something was settled, and she understood that this was, for him, as close to everything as words were going to get. From inside the room behind them, Ruth's voice came through the door, dry and precise and thoroughly herself. "Are you two going to stand in the hall all day? I still want to finish the elk chapter." Evelyn looked at the door, then at Gideon. His expression had shifted into something that was unmistakably the precursor to a smile, though it hadn't arrived there fully yet. She went back into the room, picked up the book from the nightstand, found the page, and began to read. Ruth recovered slowly, the way children recover from serious illness. In fits and starts, 2 good days followed by one exhausting one. Her energy returning not in a steady climb, but in the irregular, stubborn way that living things reassert themselves. By the end of the second week, she was sitting up and eating properly and demanding, with the focused tyranny of a convalescing 11-year-old who had discovered the social power of being unwell, that someone read to her for at least 2 hours a day. Clara bore the burden of this with the long-suffering dignity of a person who loved someone deeply and found that love inconvenient. "She made me read the same section about elk antler growth 3 times, Claire reported to Evelyn one morning, dropping into a kitchen chair with the theatrical exhaustion of someone twice her age. 3 times. She says I'm not doing the voices right. There are no voices, Evelyn said. It's a biology text. That's what I said. Clara reached for the bread basket. She said there should be. Evelyn looked at her. Read it again. Clara stared at her. Whose side are you on? Ruth's right now. She's sick. She's getting better. She's well enough to boss people around. Clara. Clara took the bread and stood up with a posture that communicated everything she thought about this injustice. Fine, she said, but I'm not doing voices. She heard Clara 10 minutes later doing something that was at minimum an attempt at vocal differentiation between narrative passages, and she heard Ruth's answering sound of satisfaction, and she stood in the kitchen with her coffee and felt something so ordinary and so complete that she had to set the cup down for a moment and simply hold it. This was what she had stayed for. Not the dramatic night of the fever, not the moment in the hallway with Gideon, not any single thing she could point to and name. This, the breadbasket and the complaining and the reading done badly and received gratefully, this was it. The question of what she and Gideon were to each other occupied the next several weeks in the way that unresolved things occupy a space, not loudly, not urgently, but constantly present at the edge of everything else. He had asked her to stay as part of the family. She had said she wasn't going anywhere. Neither of them had said anything more specific than that. And for a while the not saying felt less like avoidance and more like the natural pace of two careful people who had both, in their own ways, been burned by moving too fast toward something they wanted. He was not an easy man to know. She had understood this from the beginning, but understanding it and living inside it were different things. He communicated in what he did more than in what he said. She had learned to read the grammar of his actions the way you learn to read a new language, slowly at first, and then with increasing fluency. The way he left the lamp burning in the study when he knew she was working late. The way he asked her opinion on the spring cattle order with the same directness he used when asking Pike about fence repair, making no distinction between her judgment and anyone else's on the ranch. The way he had started, without comment or ceremony, leaving the household accounts on her side of the desk rather than his. These were not romantic gestures. They were something more durable than that. They were the gestures of someone who had decided to trust her, and who expressed trust through the language of practical inclusion rather than sentiment. She was not entirely sure how to respond in kind because her own history with the language of trust was complicated. She had trusted Douglas Crane's letters, and they had been a construction. She had trusted her stepfather's tolerance, and it had had limits she hadn't anticipated. She was someone who had learned, through accumulated evidence, to be careful about what she believed was solid. But she thought about what Ruth had said. It gets bigger the longer you're here. And she thought it was true not just of the land. She told him this one evening in the study, not directly, because directness on this particular subject felt like something that required more ground beneath it than they'd yet built, but sideways, in the way she was learning to speak when the real thing was too large to say plainly. I've been thinking about the east pasture fence, she said, which was not what she was thinking about, but was a subject that had been discussed and was therefore a legitimate door. He looked up from the supply list he was reviewing. What about it? The section that came down in the November storm. Pike patched it, but I looked at it last week and the posts on the north end are still marginal. If we get another storm like that one before spring, we'll get one, he said, which was not pessimism, but Wyoming. Then it needs doing properly before January. She set down her own papers. I know the budget is tight after the autumn feed costs, but I ran the numbers, and if we defer the smokehouse repair until March, there's enough margin to do the fence posts right. He was quiet for a moment, looking at her with that considering expression. You ran the numbers, he said. I had time on Wednesday. The smokehouse repair was already deferred from September. I know, but the fence is a more immediate problem. The smokehouse isn't going anywhere. He was quiet for another moment. Then he said, "When did you start thinking of this place as yours to worry about?" It was not an accusation. It was a genuine question, asked with a kind of careful attention, and she took it seriously. "I'm not sure exactly," she said honestly. "Somewhere around the time I moved the salt provisions in the snow." She paused. "Or possibly when I reorganized your filing system and you didn't say anything about it." "I noticed," he said. "I know." He looked at her across the desk. "Evelyn?" Just her name, the way he had said it in the hallway outside Ruth's room, carrying more weight than names usually carried. "I know what you're going to say," she said. "Do you?" "You're going to say something about the position I'm in and whether it's appropriate and whether I've thought it through." He was quiet for a moment. "That's not exactly what I was going to say." "What were you going to say?" He set down the supply list. He was not someone who performed his emotions. They moved across his face only when they were strong enough to override his considerable natural containment, which meant that when she saw something in his expression, it was real. "I was going to say that I've been trying to find the right time to have a conversation that I keep not having because I'm not—" He stopped, tried again. "I don't do this well. This kind of thing. Eleanor used to say I communicated better with cattle than with people, and she wasn't entirely wrong." "What kind of thing?" Evelyn said. "Saying what I mean when what I mean matters." He looked at her steadily. "I meant what I said in the hallway. I want you to stay, not as an employee. I want to marry you, Evelyn, if you're willing, and I want to say it plainly this time so there's no confusion about what I'm asking." The room was very quiet. Outside, the wind moved through the dark in its usual indifferent way, and somewhere down the hall she could hear the faint sound of Ruth still awake, turning pages. She had thought about this. She had thought about it more than she'd admitted to herself, and from more angles than she'd have been comfortable confessing. She had thought about what it meant to marry a man she had known for less than 2 months, on the frontier, with 2 daughters and 6,000 acres, and a community that had its opinions about her and would continue to have them regardless of what she did. She had thought about Eleanor, whose presence was in this house in ways both visible and not. In the girls' faces, in the careful order of things that Sigrid maintained, in the particular way Gideon sometimes went quiet in the evenings when the light came in at a certain angle. She was not Eleanor. She was not trying to be Eleanor. She understood this with a clarity that felt important. "I have conditions," she said. Something in his expression shifted. Not surprise exactly, but adjustment. "All right." The girls are told first, before anyone else, and they're given real space to respond, not managed, not steered. Whatever they feel about it, they're allowed to feel it. "Agreed. I keep managing the household accounts, not because I think you can't do it, but because I'm better at it, and we both know that." "Well, that one was already settled," he said, with a dryness that was as close to humor as he usually got. "And I want—" She stopped. This one was harder to say. "I want it understood between us that I'm not here to replace Eleanor, for the girls or for you. I'm not her, and I can't be her, and I'm not going to try. What I can be is who I am, which is someone who will work as hard as she can for this family and tell you the truth even when it's inconvenient and stay when things get hard." She paused. "That's what I can offer." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "That's more than most people offer." "Is it enough?" "Yes," he said. "It's enough." She nodded once, the way he nodded when something was settled. He recognized it. She could see that. He recognized his own gesture given back to him, and something in his expression softened, briefly, in a way she thought probably happened rarely. "Yes, then," she said. "I'll marry you." Telling the girls was not simple, which she had expected. She and Gideon sat with them the following evening after dinner, in the front room where the fire was going, and Ada and Sigrid had made themselves scarce with the tactful efficiency of people who understood what the conversation was going to be. Clara had positioned herself on the far end of the sofa with her arms folded before they even began, which meant she had already guessed. Ruth sat in the chair nearest the fire with her blanket, still in her convalescent mode, her face carefully neutral in the way that meant she was feeling things she hadn't sorted yet. Gideon told them plainly. He said he had asked Evelyn to marry him, and she had said yes, and he wanted to know what they thought about it. There was a silence. Clara said, "When?" "We haven't set a date yet," Gideon said. "Are you asking us or telling us?" Clara said. "I'm telling you," Gideon said, "but I'm also asking you." Clara looked at Evelyn. Evelyn did not try to soften the look she gave back. She met it directly, with the same steadiness she'd used for every hard thing since she'd arrived. She owed Clara that. "You said you weren't finished," Clara said. "I said that," Evelyn agreed. "Is this what you meant?" "Not exactly. I didn't know then what I meant. This is what it turned out to be." Clara looked at the fire. She was working through something with the methodical seriousness she brought to everything that mattered, and Evelyn waited and let her work. "Mama's still our mama," Clara said finally. It was not a question. It was a statement of fact that required acknowledgement. "Yes," Evelyn said. "She always will be. I'm not trying to be something I'm not. I'm just asking to be part of your family as myself." Clara was quiet for another moment. Then she said, "Okay," in the tone she used when she meant more than the word contained. Ruth had been looking at the fire throughout all of this, and when Clara said okay, Ruth looked up at Evelyn and said, "I already thought of you as family." It was said simply, without performance, the way Ruth said the truest things, plainly, as though they were merely facts that needed stating. Evelyn held this. She did not look away from it. "Thank you," she said. "That means more than you know." I know it does," Ruth said. "That's why I said it." The wedding happened in January, on a Saturday, in the middle of the hardest month Iron Ridge had seen in 3 years. It was not elaborate. The weather alone made elaborate impossible, and Evelyn had no interest in elaborate. She had come to Wyoming with a wedding dress she'd never worn for a man she'd never met, and the idea of performing that particular pantomime again held no appeal. She wore her best dress, the dark green wool that had gone through everything with her, and Ada put flowers, dried from the summer, kept in a jar in the kitchen, into a small bundle she didn't have to carry, but chose to. They had the ceremony in the front room of Iron Ridge Ranch, with Martha Aldis and her husband as witnesses, and Pike standing in the doorway because there wasn't room for him inside without crowding, and Sigrid and Ada at the back, Ada with her arms crossed in her usual posture, and Sigrid with her hands folded in front of her and the particular expression that meant she approved of something but was not going to make a fuss about it. The twins stood on either side of Evelyn. This was Clara's idea, stated 3 days before the wedding with the decisive brevity she used for things she'd thought through carefully. "Ruth and I are going to stand with you." It was not a request. Someone should. Evelyn had looked at her for a moment, then she said, "I'd like that." The judge who performed the ceremony was a practical man who did not embellish, which suited everyone present. The words were the words, and Gideon said them in the same voice he used for everything that mattered. Quiet, direct, meaning what he said. When Evelyn said them, she was looking at him, and she thought about all the things she could not have predicted 3 months ago standing on a platform in the cold with a telegram in her pocket and $31 to her name, and she thought that life was genuinely strange, and she was genuinely grateful for its strangeness. Afterward, Ada made a dinner that was better than their usual dinners in ways that were not explicitly acknowledged but were universally understood, and Martha Aldis brought a cake that was somewhat lopsided but tasted right, and Pike ate 3 pieces of it, standing in the doorway, and seemed content. Ruth fell asleep in her chair by 8 o'clock, still not fully recovered from the fever, and Gideon carried her upstairs without waking her. Clara stayed up until 9 and then went to bed without being told, pausing at the door of the front room to say, to no one in particular, it was a good day, and then disappearing up the stairs before anyone could respond. Evelyn sat in the front room after the guests had gone and the house had gone quiet, with the fire burning down to coals and the remains of Ada's dinner still on the table in the dining room, and she thought, yes, it was. The winter did not soften after the wedding because Wyoming winters did not soften for personal occasions. It continued as it had begun, relentless and indifferent and occasionally beautiful in the way that things are beautiful when they don't care whether you think so. The cattle needed working through the worst of it. The fence that she had pushed to repair before January held through the February storms, which justified the deferred smokehouse work, and which Evelyn noted in the household accounts with a satisfaction she did not vocalize but felt completely. She and Gideon built their marriage the way she had told him she would, through work and honesty and the slow accumulation of days that were ordinary and days that were hard and days that were occasionally neither. He did not transform into a different person than he had been. She did not transform into a different person than she was. What changed was the quality of the space between them, which gradually lost the careful formality it had carried and became something more like the ease of two people who had decided to occupy the same life and were getting used to the shape of it. He still communicated better in action than in speech. She had stopped waiting for that to change. She read the actions and she answered in kind, and when she needed words from him, she asked for them directly, which he responded to with the focused attention of someone who understood a direct request and respected it. There were hard days. There were days when the isolation of the ranch in deep winter pushed against her in ways she hadn't expected. Days when the sky was the same white from edge to edge, and the work was the same as the day before, and she felt the distance from everything familiar as a physical weight. She did not pretend these days weren't happening. She told Gideon about one of them in early February, sitting at the kitchen table after the girls were in bed. "I had a hard day," she said. He looked at her across the table. "What kind?" "The kind where it's all a bit much," she said. "Nothing specific, just all of it at once." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What do you need?" She thought about it. "Just to say it out loud, I think." "Then say it." She said more than she intended. The distance from home, the loneliness that was different from being alone, the way she sometimes woke in the night and couldn't immediately remember where she was and lay there for a moment in the dark of a room she was still learning to call hers. He listened with his elbows on the table and his hands folded in front of him and his eyes on her, not trying to fix anything, which was exactly what she needed and which she had not been certain he would understand. When she was done, he said, "Is it better or worse than you thought it would be, being here?" She considered this honestly. "Different," she said. "Not better or worse. Different than anything I thought." He nodded. "That's honest." "I try to be." "I know." He looked at her. "So do I, even when I'm not good at it." She put her hand on the table between them, and he put his over it, and they sat like that for a while in the kitchen with the fire going and the wind outside doing its usual work, and neither of them said anything else, and she found that she did not need them to. Spring came in March, which in Wyoming meant something more modest than the word implied in other places. Not warmth exactly, but a lessening, a slight relenting of the cold, the days stretching longer by visible increments. The snow pulled back from the south-facing slopes first, revealing the gray-brown grass underneath, matted and pressed flat by months of wait, and then in the low places she started to see the first tentative greening, so faint it looked like a trick of the light. The Carver family's visit came in late March, unexpected, on a Tuesday afternoon. Pauline Carver arrived at the door with a preserves jar and a smile that was doing considerable work. She had heard about the wedding, she said. She wanted to congratulate them. She said all the appropriate things in the tone of someone reading from a prepared text, and Evelyn received them with the same pleasant steadiness she had brought to the first visit, and offered coffee, and Pauline accepted it, and they sat in the front room that had been so much territory the last time, and was now, unmistakably, Evelyn's space. Pauline looked around the room with her cataloging eyes. The room had changed since October. Not drastically, not in any way that announced itself, but in the accumulated small ways that a household changes when someone who lives in it starts to feel that they live in it. A different arrangement of the chairs, books on the side table where there had been none, a drawing Clara had done, a technically precise rendering of the ranch from the east ridgeline, framed and hung on the wall near the window. "You've settled in," Pauline said. "Yes," Evelyn said. "The girls seem well." Pauline took her coffee. "Clara's grown. Ruth, too." "They've had a hard winter," Evelyn said. "They both came through it." "I heard Ruth was ill." Pauline's tone shifted very slightly, not to genuine warmth, but to something slightly less constructed. "That must have been frightening." "It was," Evelyn said. Pauline looked at her for a moment. Something moved through her expression that was more complicated than her usual presentation. A flicker of something that might have been acknowledgement or recalibration, or simply the ordinary human response to meeting someone you'd underestimated and having to revise. "You're not what I expected," Pauline said, and it was the most honest thing she'd said since Evelyn had known her. "What did you expect?" Evelyn asked. Pauline looked down at her coffee cup. "Someone more temporary," she said. "I know," Evelyn said. "That's what most people thought." Pauline left an hour later with a manner that was, if not warm, at least unguarded in a way it hadn't been before. At the door she paused and said without turning back, "The Valley respects people who last through a Wyoming winter. You should know that." Then she went. Evelyn stood at the door and watched her go and thought that this was probably as close to an apology as Pauline Carver had in her, and that it was enough. Ma'am. The news of the pregnancy she kept to herself for 6 weeks, which was partly caution and partly the old habit of not trusting good things until she had more evidence that they were real. She told Gideon on a Sunday evening in April, in the kitchen, plainly, the way she did things. "I'm going to have a baby," she said. "In October, I think." He went very still. Then he looked at her with an expression she had never seen on his face before. Not the contained, measured look he wore for most things, but something open and undefended, something that had come from further down than he usually allowed things to come from. "Are you well?" he said. "Are you?" "I'm fine," she said. "I'm very well, actually." He exhaled. He put one hand flat on the kitchen table, like he needed something to press against. "October," he said. "Around the 15th, I think. I'm not certain." He looked at her. "A boy or a girl?" "I have no idea," she said. "No one does yet." He nodded. He was still doing the thing where he pressed his hand against the table, and she thought he might not be aware he was doing it. "Gideon," she said. He looked up. "It's good news," she said. He said, "I know." And then, after a moment, with a quietness she recognized as sincerity stripped of all the covering it usually wore, "I just needed a second." She gave him the second. She stood across the table and let him have it, and she watched the thing move through him, and she thought that this was what it looked like when someone who held everything tightly finally let something in. Not graceful, not smooth, but real and unmistakable. When he looked up again, his eyes were clear. "I should tell the girls," he said. "We should tell the girls," she said. "Together." He nodded. He straightened up from the table. He put his hand briefly on her shoulder as he passed, just briefly, just once, in the way he touched things that mattered to him, with restraint but with intention, and went to find Clara and Ruth. She stayed in the kitchen for a moment. She put her hand flat on the same place on the table where his had been, and she felt the solid wood of it, Iron Ridge Ranch under her palm, and she thought, yes, this is real. This counts. Every part of it, the telegram, and the bench, and the cold storage, and the fever, and the front room, and the January wedding, and the lopsided cake, and the drawing on the wall, and this kitchen, and this table, and the man who just walked down the hall to find his daughters. All of it real, all of it hers. From down the hall she heard Clara say in a voice that was working very hard at sounding casual, "Oh," and then, "When?" And then Ruth's voice, direct and certain and entirely herself, "I knew it." And then Clara, "You did not know it." And then Ruth, "I suspected it." And then her husband's voice, low and even, answering both of them at once, and the ordinary sound of the ranch house in the evening, the fire and the wind and the distant cattle and the voices of her family moving through the walls, and Evelyn Harper, Evelyn Hale, now, though she was still getting used to hearing it, stood in the kitchen of Iron Ridge Ranch and felt, with a completeness she had not known she was capable of feeling, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. The summer of that year was the driest anyone on the ridge could remember, which in Wyoming meant something specific and unpleasant. The grass going yellow by July, the creek at the north end of the property dropping to half its usual depth, the cattle moving restless and dissatisfied between the lower pastures as the forage thinned. Gideon spent most of June and July managing water access, negotiating informally with 2 neighboring ranches about shared creek rights, watching the sky with the particular attention of a man whose livelihood depended on reading it correctly. Evelyn was 5 months along by midsummer and had made a private decision early in the pregnancy that she was not going to become someone who reduced herself to her condition. She continued the household accounts, continued the girls' lessons, continued the correspondence and the supply negotiations and the slow, ongoing work of making Iron Ridge function at its best. She was tired in ways she hadn't anticipated, a bone-level weariness that appeared without warning, sometimes at 2 in the afternoon in the middle of a sentence, like a lamp being turned down. But she managed it the way she managed most things, by acknowledging it to herself and adjusting without dramatizing. Sigrid watched her with the assessing eyes of a woman who had seen pregnancies on the frontier before and had opinions about all of them. "You're doing too much," Sigrid said one morning, appearing in the doorway of the study with the directness she applied to everything. "I'm doing what needs doing," Evelyn said, without looking up from the ledger. "Those are the same thing to you," Sigrid said. "That's the problem." Evelyn set down her pen and looked at her. "What would you have me do instead?" "Sit more," Sigrid said. "Let the ranch run itself for one afternoon." "The ranch doesn't run itself. That's the entire point of the work." Sigrid made the sound, the M, that indicated she had registered the argument and found it insufficient. "Your mother-in-law rested," she said. "Eleanor rested." "Eleanor and I are different people," Evelyn said, gently but clearly. "I rest when I need to." Sigrid looked at her for another moment, then said, "Pike fixed the north fence post," and left, which was her way of conceding a point while maintaining dignity. The truth was that the work was, in some sense, how Evelyn rested. This was something she had come to understand about herself over the winter at Iron Ridge, that the particular anxiety she carried, the low hum of uncertainty about whether she was needed and whether she was valued and whether she had made herself indispensable enough to justify her presence, that anxiety quieted when she was working. It did not disappear. She did not think it would ever disappear entirely, but it became manageable, the way a persistent noise becomes manageable once you understand its source. She was working on this. Gideon knew about it because she had told him, on one of the evenings when the kitchen was quiet, and she had been honest in the way she was honest when the day had been long enough to wear down her defenses. He had listened to her describe the feeling, the low, constant need to justify being here, to earn her place again each morning as though the day before hadn't counted. And he had not tried to argue her out of it or reassure her that it wasn't rational. He had said, "I know what that's like." And she had looked at him and understood that he meant it, that a man raising 2 daughters alone on 6,000 acres after losing his wife had his own version of the same feeling, and that knowing this changed something between them, deepened it into a territory that was harder to reach but more solid once you got there. They were not a perfect couple. She needed to say things aloud, and he needed to have them received silently, and navigating the space between those two tendencies was ongoing and sometimes frustrating. He had a stubbornness about certain ranch decisions that ran up against her practicality in ways that produced real disagreement. Not the gentle friction of people who were fundamentally aligned, but the harder friction of people who were both convinced they were right and were sometimes both correct about different aspects of the same problem. She had a tendency, when she was overwhelmed, to become efficient in a way that read as cold, and he had learned to ask directly whether she was all right rather than wait for a signal that she found it difficult to give. They worked at it. That was the honest description. They worked at it the way the ranch worked, with daily attention, with willingness to repair what needed repairing, without the expectation that it would ever be finished. Clara turned 12 in August, and she asked for one specific thing: to ride the outer fence line with her father and Evelyn, the full circuit, which took most of a day and covered the edges of the property from the North Creek to the South Canyon wall. It was not a traditional birthday request. It was entirely Clara. They left at dawn, all 3 of them, with Pike holding the girls' horses until they were mounted and Ruth standing on the porch in her nightgown, watching them go with an expression that was working very hard at not being jealous. "I'll be back by dinner," Clara called to her. "I know," Ruth said with dignity. "I have things to do." She did not have things to do. But Evelyn had left her 3 chapters of a new biology text, something Dr. Weston had brought from Cheyenne on his last visit, a more recent volume than anything Ruth had read. And by the time they turned the horses out of the yard, she knew Ruth would have found it on the schoolroom table and would be somewhere between grateful and suspicious about whether she was being managed, which she was, but gently and with affection. They rode the fence line through a morning that was cooler than July had been. The first suggestion of the season turning, the light coming in at a slightly different angle, the grass that had gone dry and yellow in the heat beginning to show, at its roots, the faint possibility of green. Gideon rode ahead where the terrain required single file, and Evelyn rode beside Clara where it opened up. And they talked and didn't talk in the comfortable mixture that had developed between them over months of shared mornings and afternoon lessons and evenings around the same table. "Do you miss it?" Clara asked, somewhere around mid-morning. They were on the east section, the ridgeline rising to their left and the valley floor visible below, the ranch building small and precise at this distance. "Miss what?" Evelyn said. "Before, wherever you were before." Evelyn thought about Beaumont, the schoolhouse with its 30 children and its inadequate heating, and the principal who thought he was managing the accounts. The rented room with the window that faced a brick wall, the train platform in Harlan Creek, and the telegram, and the bench. "Some things," she said honestly. "Not most of it." Clara rode for a moment in silence. "Do you miss the person you were going to marry?" It was a very Clara question, unguarded, direct, asked with the genuine curiosity of someone who wanted information rather than an emotional response. "No," Evelyn said. "I don't think I knew him well enough to miss him. I miss what I thought the future was going to look like. But that's different." "How?" "Missing a person and missing a plan are different kinds of loss. One of them is real and one of them is—" She considered. "One of them is grief. The other one is just disappointment. Disappointment passes." Clara thought about this with the serious attention she gave to things worth thinking about. "Does grief pass?" "No," Evelyn said. "It just changes shape. It gets smaller but denser maybe. You carry it differently after a while." Clara was looking ahead at her father's back 20 yards in front of them. "Is that true for Papa too?" "I think so." "You'd have to ask him." "He doesn't talk about it." "He talks about it less than you'd like," Evelyn said. "That's different from not talking about it at all. He talks about your mother to me sometimes. At night." Clara looked at her. "What does he say?" "That she was braver than anyone he knew." She paused. "And that she would have had opinions about the east pasture drainage." Clara made a sound that was, unmistakably, a laugh. Short and surprised and completely unguarded. The laugh of someone caught off guard by something being exactly right. She covered it almost immediately, but Evelyn had heard it, and she counted it among the things she would remember. Gideon, ahead of them, turned in his saddle. "What's funny?" "Nothing," Claire said, in the tone she used when something was. He looked at Evelyn. She kept her expression neutral. He turned back around with the long-suffering patience of a man who had learned to accept that women on this ranch communicated in a frequency he could not always access, and they rode on. The baby came in October, as Evelyn had predicted, on the 14th. It was not an easy birth. She would have described it afterward with the same practical honesty she applied to everything difficult, as long and harder than she'd expected and managed. Dr. Weston was there, which she was grateful for in a deep and specific way. Ada was there, which she was grateful for in a different way. Ada, who had delivered 3 babies in her own life, and who worked beside Weston with a calm competence that asked no credit and sought no acknowledgement and simply did what needed doing. Gideon was downstairs. She had sent him downstairs. He had argued briefly, and she had said, "I need you to not be in this room right now," which was honest, and he had respected it, and she could hear him below. Not pacing, because he was not a pacer, but moving. The irregular sound of someone finding reasons to occupy themselves in a house where the important thing was happening somewhere above them. The twins were in the schoolroom. Ruth had apparently decided to handle the waiting by reading aloud to Clara from the mammalian anatomy text, covering, with academic thoroughness, the reproductive systems of large mammals. Clara had apparently decided that this was preferable to thinking about what was happening upstairs and was listening with more attention than she usually gave to biology. Evelyn learned all of this afterward, because afterward there was a great deal of talking, in the way that relief produces talking. The rush of words that comes when a long tension finally releases, and everyone needs to say things to prove to themselves that they can. The baby was a boy. He was small and dark-haired and had his father's watchful eyes and his mother's particular expression of focused assessment. And when they put him in her arms for the first time, she held him and looked at him and felt something that she could not have articulated to anyone and did not try to. Gideon came up when it was over. He came through the door and stopped and looked at her in the bed with the baby, and she watched his face do the thing it had done when she told him she was pregnant. The opened-up look, the undefended thing rising through his usual containment. Except this time it was larger than she had seen from him before, and she understood that she was watching a man encounter something that exceeded his ability to manage it, and that this was not weakness, but its opposite. He sat on the edge of the bed. He looked at the baby. He put out one finger, and the baby's hand, absurdly small, improbably perfect, closed around it with the blind, determined grip of something new to the world and already holding on. "James," Evelyn said. They had agreed on the name in June. "He looks like a James." "He looks like he's making a decision," Gideon said. "He gets that from you." He looked up at her, and the corner of his mouth moved in a way that she had learned, over 10 months of marriage, was the fullest version of a smile she was likely to get. And it was, she had decided, entirely sufficient. The twins came up an hour later, crowding into the doorway together in the way they still did everything. In tandem, occupying the same space, two versions of the same essential person pointing at slightly different angles. Clara looked at the baby with the expression of someone running a rapid assessment. Ruth looked at him with her head tilted, already trying to understand what category of thing he was. "He's very small," Clara said. "Babies are," Evelyn said. "He'll get bigger." "What if he cries a lot?" Clara said. "He will cry a lot." "How much?" "A great deal," Evelyn said. "Probably at inconvenient times." Clara absorbed this. "Okay," she said, which meant she had accepted it and filed it appropriately. Ruth had moved closer, to the edge of the bed, and was looking at James with the intense scientific interest she brought to living things. "He has Papa's eyebrows," she said. "He does," Evelyn agreed. "That's unfortunate," Ruth said, and then looked up quickly. "I don't mean that badly. I just mean they're very serious eyebrows for a baby." From the doorway, Gideon said, "I can hear you, Ruth." "I know," Ruth said, unperturbed. "I wasn't saying anything wrong." James, at this point, opened his mouth and demonstrated the lung capacity that would, in the coming weeks, prove to be his most consistently expressed trait. Clara stepped back 2 inches. Ruth leaned forward with heightened interest. Gideon took him from Evelyn with the careful deliberateness of a man handling something irreplaceable. And the crying continued, and the room was full of noise and warmth, and the particular managed chaos of a family absorbing a new member. And it was not peaceful, not in the least, but it was completely, unmistakably right. The winter that followed James's birth was easier than the previous one, though not because Wyoming had softened. The difference was internal. The ranch running with a smoothness that had been built through the accumulated work of nearly a year, the household settled into its rhythms, the systems Evelyn had put in place operating well enough that the extraordinary demands of a newborn could be absorbed without the whole structure coming apart. She was more tired than she had ever been in her life. She said this to Ada one morning, standing at the kitchen counter with James on her shoulder, making sounds of unclear intent, and Ada, without turning from the stove, said, "Yes. Just yes. No elaboration, no advice, no reassurance." "That's all you have," Evelyn said. "That's all there is," Ada said. "It's hard. Then it gets easier. Then something else is hard." She turned briefly to look at Evelyn and the baby. "You're doing fine." Coming from Ada, who did not distribute assessments carelessly, this was worth something. Clara, who had expressed measured acceptance of her brother in October, had by December developed what she would have categorized as a practical interest in him, and what anyone watching could see was something considerably warmer than that. She held him with the focused competence of someone who had decided to learn a skill and was applying herself to it, and she talked to him while she held him with the same direct, no-nonsense delivery she used for everything, informing him about the ranch, about the cattle, about the geometry of the east pasture, as though he were a small adult who had simply not yet acquired the data he needed. Ruth's relationship with James was harder to categorize. She observed him with great attention, asked Evelyn precise questions about developmental milestones, and read a chapter about infant neurology that she had found in Weston's latest delivery of books. She was gentle with him in a way that was less instinctive than Clara's and more deliberate. The way Ruth was gentle with things she found genuinely interesting, carefully, with respect for the fact that she didn't fully understand them yet. One afternoon in December, Evelyn came into the front room and found Ruth sitting with James on her lap, not reading to him, not talking to him, just sitting with him with her hand resting lightly on his back and her face wearing an expression Evelyn hadn't seen from her before. Open, unguarded, not performing anything for anyone. She stopped in the doorway and watched for a moment. Ruth looked up. She did not remove her hand from James's back. "He stopped crying when I did this," she said. "Warmth helps," Evelyn said. Ruth looked back down at him. "He smells like something familiar," she said. "I can't figure out what." Evelyn came and sat in the chair beside the sofa. "What do you think it is?" Ruth considered. "Home," she said finally, with the slight surprise of someone arriving at an answer they hadn't expected. "He smells like home." Evelyn looked at her daughter. She had been thinking of them both as hers for months now, not with any ceremony, just quietly and continually, the way you think of things that belong to you. And she thought that Ruth, at 11 going on 45, had a capacity for naming true things that most adults never developed. "He does," Evelyn said. "You're right." Ruth nodded, satisfied, and looked back at the baby, and the afternoon light came in through the west window and fell across both of them. And it was an ordinary moment in an ordinary house, and it was, for that reason, everything. Spring came again, and with it the news that the Harlan Creek School Board had been unable to fill the teaching position they'd offered Evelyn the previous autumn. Thomas Emmett came out to the ranch in April with a proposal. Not a full-time position, because she had made clear that was not possible, but a part-time arrangement, 2 mornings a week, structured around the school's most basic needs and her own constraints. She talked to Gideon about it that evening. "What do you want to do?" he said. He had learned over the course of their marriage that this was the right first question. Not what was practical, not what was manageable, but what she actually wanted. "I want to do it," she said. "I miss teaching, not the position, not the independence of it the way I thought I wanted it last year, but the actual work, being in a room with children who are learning something." She paused. "Is that manageable? With James and the ranch?" "We'll manage it," he said. "You don't know that yet." "No," he agreed, "but we'll manage it." He looked at her. "You figured out how to run this ranch and raise 2 daughters and keep the books and save one of those daughters' lives in a blizzard. I think you can handle 2 mornings a week in a schoolhouse." She looked at him. "That's the most words you've strung together at once in a while." "I've been thinking about how to say it since you mentioned Emmett," he said, with the complete absence of shame of someone who had accepted their own communication patterns and worked within them. She accepted the position. She rode into town on Tuesdays and Thursdays, first alone while James was very small, then later with James on her lap in the cart when he was old enough to travel reliably and young enough to sleep through most of it. The school in Harlan Creek had 14 students ranging from 6 to 14, and she taught them with the same approach she had used with Clara and Ruth, starting from what they were genuinely interested in, building the technical scaffolding around that interest, treating them as people capable of genuine thought rather than vessels to be filled with facts. Word got around, as word did in a small community. By the end of the first term, 3 families who had not been sending their children regularly had started sending them every day. Emmett told her this with the satisfaction of a man whose gamble had paid off. She received it without false modesty, but also without excess pride. It was the work. The work worked. That was all. Pauline Carver told someone who told Martha Aldis, who told Evelyn, that the general opinion in the valley had shifted. This was not something Evelyn had been pursuing, but she received it with a kind of quiet satisfaction that she thought was honest. She had not come to the Wyoming Territory to win anyone's approval, but she was not indifferent to belonging. She had wanted for a long time, before she could have named it, to be somewhere that she was genuinely part of, not tolerated, not temporary, not there by someone's sufferance. She wanted to be woven in. She was learning, slowly, what that felt like. Margaret Carver, it turned out, had married the school teacher from town the previous winter, which Pauline had eventually reconciled herself to with the resigned grace of a woman who had discovered that her children were their own people, regardless of her plans for them. Margaret came to Evelyn's school on a Thursday in May to introduce herself properly, and they had a conversation that lasted considerably longer than either of them expected. And afterward, Evelyn thought that she might, in time, become someone worth knowing. On a morning in late September when James was nearly a year old and the turning of the season had brought the particular quality of light that Evelyn had come to think of as Wyoming's best offering, clear and angled and entirely without sentiment, she was standing at the east window of the upper hallway when Clara appeared beside her. Clara was 12 now, moving through the awkward threshold between the child Evelyn had met on that cart in October and whatever she was becoming. She was tall for her age, serious, increasingly precise in both her thinking and her speech. She had decided she wanted to be an engineer and had said so to Gideon with the directness of someone stating a fact, and Gideon, to his permanent credit, had said, "Then we'll figure out how," and had written to a school in Cheyenne for information. She stood beside Evelyn at the window and they looked out at the ridge together, the grass going gold and the sky doing the thing it did in September that made you feel simultaneously very small and very located, very specifically here and nowhere else. "Do you remember what I said on the cart?" Clara said. "The first day. You said a lot of things on the first day. I asked how long you were going to stay." Clara kept her eyes on the ridge. "You said 2 weeks to start." "I did," Evelyn said. "That was almost a year ago." "It was." Clara was quiet for a moment, then, "I'm glad you stayed past the 2 weeks." Evelyn looked at her. Clara's profile was Gideon's, but the same clean line of jaw, the same quality of stillness when she was thinking, but her eyes were her mother's, or so Ada had told her once. She was a whole person assembled from all of them and entirely herself, which was exactly what children were, and which was never anything less than extraordinary when you were paying attention. "So am I," Evelyn said. "You could have left," Clara said. "When you got the school offer, it would have been a good life, the house and the salary and everything." "It would have been," Evelyn agreed. "Why didn't you?" She had thought about this many times, in many versions, and she had different answers at different points, and she thought that all of them were probably true simultaneously. Because a good life and the right life aren't always the same thing, she said. The school offer was a good life. This, she gestured, not at the window specifically, but at everything the window faced and everything behind her, and the sound of James's voice from downstairs where Sigrid was managing his morning with competent affection. This is the right life. For me. It might not be for someone else. It just happens to be for me. Clara considered this with her usual seriousness. How do you know the difference? You feel it, in the specific, ordinary moments, not the dramatic ones. She thought about Ruth and the coffee with 2 hands. She thought about the salt provisions in the snow. She thought about Gideon in the hallway after the fever broke, saying her name the way he said things that mattered. It's the Tuesday afternoon feeling, not the feeling of something important happening, the feeling of being exactly in the right place on a Tuesday afternoon when nothing particular is happening at all. Clara was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, I think I understand that. You will, Evelyn said. More over time. From downstairs, James had escalated from words to demands, the full-throated, imperious cry of a nearly 1-year-old who had decided that breakfast was not arriving on a schedule that met his requirements. Clara turned from the window. I'll go, she said. You don't have to. I know, Clara said, already moving down the hallway, and Evelyn heard her on the stairs, heard the pitch of James's complaint shift as Clara's voice entered the room below, heard Sigrid say something in Norwegian that she'd stopped trying to translate, heard the morning settle into its noise. She stayed at the window for 1 more minute. The ridge caught the early light and held it, as it did every morning, indifferent to everything, and somehow, for that reason, steadying, the permanence of it, the scale of it, the way it had been here before any of them, and would be here long after. She had grown up understanding the world in human dimensions, bounded by streets and walls and the distances you could walk. Out here the scale was different. It still startled her sometimes, in the way that things that are genuinely large occasionally override your acclimatization and return you to the first encounter. She had come here abandoned. She had come with nothing real to hold on to and a plan that had already failed before she arrived. She had sat on a bench in October cold and run the calculation of her options and found them inadequate. She thought about the woman who had done that. Not with pity, not with the false warmth of retrospective comfort, but with something more honest. That woman had been frightened and practical and too stubborn to cry on a public bench, and she had accepted a stranger's offer of temporary shelter because she had nothing better. And she had walked into a household that didn't know what to do with her, and she had made herself necessary through the patient, unglamorous work of being present and paying attention and not leaving. Nobody had rescued her. Not Gideon, not the girls, not the ranch itself. She had made the decisions. She had stayed when she could have left, more than once, and the staying was not passivity or resignation. It was the hardest kind of choice, the kind that requires you to believe in something that hasn't proven itself yet. This was what she had come to understand, and it was what she would have said to the woman on the bench if such things were possible, though she doubted that woman would have been ready to hear it. Belonging is not something that happens to you. It is not conferred by circumstance or confirmed by other people's acceptance. It is constructed daily through the small and unromantic acts of showing up and doing the work and choosing to stay and then staying. She had built this. It had not been given to her. She had shown up at a stranger's ranch with a trunk and a hat box and $31, and the particular determination of someone who had decided, in the absence of any other reliable option, to make herself useful. And she had done exactly that. And from that foundation, through months of hard weather and difficult people and real grief and ordinary Tuesdays, she had built something that was entirely and completely hers. She turned from the window. James was still issuing his morning proclamations from the kitchen. Gideon would be up from the barn in 20 minutes, smelling of horses and cold air, expecting coffee and finding it because Ada was already there. Ruth was in the schoolroom, probably already reading, having woken an hour ago and slipped downstairs without telling anyone because she was Ruth and morning was hers. Clara was in the kitchen managing her brother with the same focused competence she brought to everything. Iron Ridge Ranch was awake. Iron Ridge Ranch was hers. She went downstairs. She went downstairs to her kitchen and her children and her husband and the work of the day, which was the same as the work of every day. Imperfect, demanding, sometimes too much, always enough. And she went without hesitation, without looking back at the window or the ridge or the particular quality of that September light, because she did not need to. She knew where she was. She knew who she was. She was exactly where she was supposed to be, and she had gotten there the only way anyone ever gets anywhere that matters. Not by being chosen, but by choosing every day to stay.